Hello YouTube friends. Well, today is August 16th, 2007, and I thought this would be a good date to come on and tell another of my unexplained occurrences or unexplained happenings. I've told several of those before here on YouTube, and I've had mixed reaction. Mainly I've had real good response, had a lot of views of those videos that told about unexplained things. And of course I've had some hater comments like, "Old man, why don't you get off the juice?" and "What are you smoking, old man?" to see things like that. But I want to assure you the things I've told are true. They happen just as I told them. And I'm not a believer in the supernatural, and I don't believe in ghosts and such as that. But in my life several times things have happened that I could not explain. And tonight I want to tell you another one of those. As I said, today is August 16th, 2007. And you've probably heard by now, if you've watched any of the news today, that today is the anniversary of the death, the 30th anniversary of the death of Elvis Presley. He died in Memphis, Tennessee. Of course, Elvis was known worldwide, and I think anyone that watches this will know who I'm referring to. But anyway, he died 30 years ago today. So I want to tell you another one of my unexplained occurrences, happenings, that happened to me 29 years ago. Not today, but 29 years ago. And it happened in Memphis, Tennessee. And it is concerning Elvis in Memphis. And to make this make a little sense, and I'm known now for telling, for having long videos and telling long stories, so just make yourself comfortable and sit back and you can listen to this one. And it does draw out when I get to telling my stories. So get you something good to eat, something cool to drink, and just sit back and maybe you'll enjoy the story. But anyway, back in the 70s, I worked at and this all ties in, believe it or not, but I worked at that aluminum reduction plant and also aluminum tubing mill, a rolling mill where they made aluminum tubing. And also during those years, well, for most of my life and still, I've been an amateur radio operator, a ham radio operator. And one of the things that ham radios, or most ham radio operators love, is making antennas to use with their radios. They call them beam antennas. And they're made from different sizes of aluminum tubing. So at this aluminum plant, I had access to, it wasn't really scrap, but excess aluminum tubing that I could buy for a very good price. So I came up with the idea that I would buy that aluminum tubing for a very, very low price, scrap price almost. And I would cut it up into lengths and come up with some instructions, and I would make antenna kits for other hams, amateur radio operators that wanted to build, they call them Yagi antennas, but it's a tubing antenna. It's got several elements. It's a beam antenna, if you've ever heard anything about directional antennas. But anyway, I started doing that, and I was buying this tubing, make it into kits, put it into boxes, and I sold quite a few of them. One of the best ways at that time, and I guess still, to merchandise amateur radio equipment is to go to amateur radio operator festivals, and they call these things Ham Fest, since they call amateur radio operators hams, and festival they shorten it to Ham Fest. And just about all year round, just about every month, there was a pretty good size ham fest within driving distance of where I live here in North Alabama. And as part of my part-time hobby job of making these antennas and selling them, I'd go off and find a ham fest and drive off to it. Like I said, this was 1978. Elvis died in 77, I believe it was. This was 1978. So happened that one of these ham fests in the year of 1978, it's the first time I'd ever been to a Memphis ham fest. Might have been the first time I ever went to Memphis. I don't remember right now. But anyway, they usually had these ham fests on a Friday night, Saturday, and sometime Sunday. And you would go there, and you could either go and attend the Ham Fest. There were a lot of big vendors, a lot of the big time people that made radios would show up and try to show their latest radio and sell those. And they had what they call flea markets, where you could sell used equipment, and people like me that had maybe a small item that they were trying to sell to hams could set up and try to sell those things. So I had an old van, and I packed it full of as many antennas as I thought I might sell. And usually on these weekends I would sell maybe 6 to a dozen antennas over the whole weekend. So it was fairly profitable. It wasn't real hard work, and I enjoyed going off also and attending the ham festivals, ham conventions. So anyway, I can't remember now what month it was. It was during the summertime. That particular weekend I was to go off to Memphis. So after I got in from work on Friday afternoon, I packed up my old van, and I'd made it's kind of a work van, but I had prepared it for going off and spending the night, and I had a sleeping bunk in it, and things that you could kind of not have to pay for a motel room and still go off and stay at the Hamfest. So I packed that thing up and took off from Memphis, and it was the middle of the night, later in the night when I got there. And Memphis, and I think still do at that time, had their Hamfest at the Memphis Fairgrounds. It's kind of an amusement park, public area in Memphis. But anyway, they had this at I think they call it Municipal Auditorium at the Fairgrounds was the name of the place that they were having the get-together. So I arrived over there up the night, and there were several other people around that were like me, coming to set up their booths or their flea market area. And at that time, most of the people that sold like I did had an outside booth, and then the bigger vendors had inside the auditorium where they would set up. So anyway, I got there and found me a place I thought was pretty good, and got my van parked and kind of got my tables out and got them set up for the next morning, and messed around and talked to some of the other vendors there, and was kind of enjoying being in Memphis. And it always, I guess, in the back of your mind, especially a year after Elvis had died, that's kind of in the back of your mind that you're going to the home of the king, to Memphis, Tennessee. Of course, I thought about that on the way over there, about him dying a year before, and I'd be spending the night there in Memphis, and it was on my mind for sure. But anyway, I got on up the night and got to be bedtime, and all the other vendors were going to bed, and nobody much up to talk with, so I prepared to get in the back of my van and also go to bed and go to sleep, because I had to get up fairly early the next morning to start to try to sell the antennas. So anyway, I got in bed, and everything was quiet around there. It's a quiet area. Wasn't a lot of traffic in that area, so it was very quiet, and should have been able to sleep. And of course, you always think about things that you may do the next day, and I was laying in the bunk in the back of the van and thinking about the next morning, things I need to do, and getting ready to go to sleep. And I almost dozed off, but I kept hearing something, and I laid there and thought to myself, well, somebody nearby in one of the other vehicles had a radio playing, or a tape playing at that time. Didn't have CDs in those days, so they had to be playing tapes, maybe even 8-track tapes. I can't remember. I guess they were still around at that time. But it kept going on, and it was getting louder, and I could hear that it was a male voice singing, and it was singing a cappella. There was no music in behind it. It was just a male voice, and it was getting louder. And I tried to turn over and go to sleep, and I didn't hear any other commotion. Just looked around, kind of looked out the window, and it looked like everybody else was already sacked out, but I still heard that music, and it bothered me. But I couldn't go to sleep. The music was still playing, and I was kind of restless anyway. So I thought, well, maybe somebody is still up that wants to talk. So I got up and got out of the van, and when I got out of the van, I could hear the music even better. And it seemed to be coming from over toward the auditorium where we would have the meeting, the Hamfest, next day. So it was a pretty night, and it was quiet, so I thought I'd just walk around and see where the music was coming from. So I walked, and I was parked real close to the front entrance to the auditorium, just very close, off to the side, but still close to the front. And it sounded like the singing sounded like it was coming from toward the back of the auditorium. So that's the way I walked, which was to the right. It was counterclockwise around. It's a good-sized building, big building. So I started walking to the right, and sure enough, the music got louder. And the further I walked, the more the music sounded like it was coming from inside the auditorium. It wasn't coming from a vehicle outside. I already left the people that were parked there that were going to be there for the next day. So it sounded like it was either behind the auditorium or inside the auditorium. So I said, I'll just walk around the auditorium and see where this is coming from. And it was getting louder as I did that. So I walked toward the rear, and sure enough, got around the corner and walked up to the rear of the building. There were some big doors there. But by that time, I could tell the music, the singing was coming from inside the building. And the singing was building in volume as I walked around. In a male voice. And it was coming from inside the building, no doubt. So I walked up to the doors, and there were 6 or 8 doors across there, and shook every door. They were all locked. And I tried to look inside, but the way it was arranged, you couldn't see into the auditorium. It was not a clear view in the auditorium, but the music was still there. So I started walking again. Kept walking in the same direction, walked around the next corner, down on the next side of the building, and there were some more doors. I thought, well, somebody's inside playing. They've got a tape machine plugged into that amplifier system, and they're testing it out for tomorrow, so they'll know the sound system works good tomorrow, and I'll just go in and talk to them. So I went up those next doors, and again, several doors there, shook every one of them. Couldn't get in. They were all locked. So the music was still playing, and louder than ever. If you've ever approached a concert late and been outside the building and the show has already started on the inside of the building, by this time that voice, that single a cappella voice inside that building, was reverberating. You know how it sounds when you're outside and you hear it kind of rumbling inside. This sound had gotten so loud it was reverberating, kind of echoing. And it made me even more sure that somebody was inside this building testing out the PA system. So the next corner would have brought me back to the front of the building and back to where my van was parked. I'd walked all the way around this building. It took me, I guess, 8 or 10 minutes to walk around it. The music had gone on all this time, still was going on. I rounded that last corner, and I thought, well, whoever's in there has come and gone in these front doors, so I'll be able to walk up and go in the front door and see who's playing the music, maybe talk to them about what's going to go on tomorrow. So I did that. But before I got up, I started up the steps. Before I got up the steps to those front doors, that music quit, stopped. No more sound, dead silence. Dead may be a good word here, but dead silence. And I walked up those front doors, and I thought, well, I'm going to see that person back in there closing down his equipment, and he'll be coming out. So I went up to those front doors, and I could see back in the auditorium. There was one little light back on, just kind of I guess it was a night light back on in the auditorium. It wasn't a sound, wasn't a soul to be seen. Where I could look through those front doors and see all the way back inside this auditorium. I could see the stage they had set up for tomorrow. I could see the microphone set up that they'd use to announce different things at the Memphis. But there was no one inside in that building. Walked up to those doors, and the doors were locked. Now, in my mind, what I thought, somebody was in there testing that sound system. By the time I rounded the side of the building, they got through, turned it off, and they had gone out one of the other doors. That was that satisfied my mind as what I was hearing that night. So I went back to my van and didn't think about it a whole lot. And went in the van, went to sleep, slept good that night. Got up the next morning. I heard people out stirring around, so I got up the next morning and got out and got my antennas set up, my signs set up, and all that. And I sold several antennas that day. And I didn't think about that a lot all day long. But finally, later in the afternoon, I think I'd maybe sold out antennas or got tired of selling antennas or something. I decided I would put everything back in my van, and I'd go in and enjoy the festivities myself. And I could walk right in the front doors, and walked in the front doors. Sometimes thousands of people attend these things. It's quite crowded. And they usually have a platform or a stage set up, and they have some of the people that running the ham fest there with a PA system and a microphone, and they have giveaways, and they announce attention calls for people who might need to come to the telephone or just whatever. But they always have some kind of PA system set up. So I walked in there and started walking around and looking at things and interested in what was on the tables and what was for sale and all this. And about that time, the PA announcer stepped up to the PA system and made, I think he was giving away a walkie-talkie or something. He announced it. One of the worst PA systems I've ever heard. It was tinny, it was weak, it had no volume to it, no bass sound to it. It was not what I heard the night before, for sure, for certain. It couldn't have not have been what I heard the night before. What I heard the night before was loud, full volume, good bass sound, like I say, reverberating in the building. It was not this PA system. And it kind of put a thought in my mind about what had I heard the night before. It definitely was not that PA system. So I went about my business, walking around and still visiting some of the other vendors and looking at radios, and I think I even bought something. And before I left, usually these ham fests are put on by local hams, and they're usually some old hams. I'm getting to be an old ham now. I've been a ham radio operator since I was 16, 15 or 16, so I'm going on towards 40 years. But anyway, there are always a lot of old ham radio operators around. So I found one of the old guys there that was putting on the convention, and I walked up and started up a conversation with him, and I was thinking I wanted to ask him something. So after we'd kind of talked for a few minutes, I said, Elvis used to visit this fairground I've read. He said, yeah, that's right. Said he would rent this whole fairground. They had carnival rides there. He said Elvis would rent this. I said, I remember it well. He'd rent this whole fairgrounds. Loved this place. He'd rent this whole fairgrounds, and he loved to ride the roller coasters, and the bumper cars was his favorite thing. But he'd bring all his friends down here, and sometimes from midnight to daylight they would ride and just have a big time down here. And I said, well, I thought that's what I'd heard. And I said, has Elvis ever performed in this auditorium? He said from some of his earliest performances were right here, right up on this stage. So Elvis had performed in this building, and that again kind of tweaked my interest. And I said, well, Elvis sang gospel songs, didn't he? And he said he sure did. And he said, what are you getting at? And I said, last night I heard singing in this building. And he looked kind of funny, and he said, you can stop right there. He said, you heard how great they are, how great thou art, being sung by a single male voice, didn't you? And cold chills just ran all over me. And as I've said before in some of my videos, just telling this, they run all over me again. And I said, that's what I heard. And he just grinned and said no more. And I didn't ask anymore. But ever since then, I wish I had quizzed him more on why he said that. Evidently somebody else had heard the same thing in that auditorium. And I definitely heard it. And that building was definitely locked. And that PA system that they had used in that day was not what I heard the night before. I heard a beautiful a cappella male voice singing How Great Thou Art, and it sounded just like Elvis Presley. Now that's another of my unexplained happenings. And before most people have written in and had their own thoughts about what happened, trying to explain it. I couldn't explain it then. I can't explain it now. Maybe somebody around can. Good night.